The autumn sun hung low over the Texas plains, casting long shadows across the weathered fence posts that marked the boundary of the Henderson Ranch. Samuel had been working this land for near 30 years now, and he knew every crease in the dry earth, every bend in the creek that wound its way through his property. At 58, his hands bore the calluses of honest work, and his face carried the lines that came from squinting into too many sunrises. He was mending a section of fence when he first saw her. A young woman, maybe 25 years old, stumbling through the tall grass that grew wild beyond his pasture. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her dark hair tangled with burrs and brambles. She moved like someone who had been walking for days without rest, her shoulders hunched forward as if she were carrying an invisible weight. Samuel set down his hammer and watched her approach. There was something about the way she walked that reminded him of a wounded animal, both desperate for help and terrified of coming too close. As she drew nearer, he could see the exhaustion etched deep in her features, the way her eyes darted left and right, as if she expected trouble to emerge from every shadow. She stopped at his fence line about 20 feet away from where he stood. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. Samuel could see her hands shaking as she gripped the fence post. "Please," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't eaten in 3 days. I can work. I'm strong despite how I look right now." Samuel studied her face and saw something there that made his heart ache. It was the same look he had seen in his own mirror years ago when he was young and desperate and convinced that the whole world was against him. Back then it had been his own father's kindness that saved him. The old man had taken him in when everyone else in town had written him off as no good. "What's your name?" Samuel asked gently. "Elizabeth," she replied. "Elizabeth Wells." "Well, Elizabeth, I was just about to head in for some lunch. My wife Martha makes the best cornbread in 3 counties, and there's always more than enough for company." Elizabeth's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You don't even know me," she said. "You don't know what I've done." Samuel leaned against the fence post and considered his words carefully. In his experience, people who said things like that were usually their own harshest judges. "I know you're hungry," he said. "I know you're tired. And I know that everyone deserves a chance to rest and eat a decent meal." The tears that had been threatening to fall finally spilled over, and Elizabeth wiped them away with the back of her dirt-stained hand. "Do I disgust you?" She asked, the words coming out in a rush. "The way I look, the way I smell. I know I must be horrible to look at." Samuel just stared for a moment, not because he was repulsed, but because he was struck by the raw vulnerability in her question. It reminded him of something his father had told him long ago about how the people who needed kindness most were often the ones who felt least deserving of it. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice steady and warm, "the only thing that would disgust me would be turning away someone who needs help when I have the power to give it." He opened the gate and gestured for her to follow him. As they walked toward the ranch house, Samuel told her about the place, how he and Martha had built it up from nothing over the years, how they had lost 2 children in infancy, and how that loss had taught them to cherish every moment of grace they were given. How they had learned that sometimes the best way to honor their own blessings was to share them with others. The ranch house was a simple structure built of local stone with a wide front porch where Martha liked to sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. She was there now, shelling peas into a large ceramic bowl when she saw them approaching. Martha was 55 with silver-streaked hair and eyes the color of prairie grass. She had the kind of face that made people want to tell her their troubles. Samuel made the introductions, and Martha simply nodded and said, "Well then, you just sit yourself down right here on the porch while I get you something to eat. Samuel, you help her get cleaned up." There was no judgment in Martha's voice, no questions about where Elizabeth had come from or what had brought her to their door. Just the simple acknowledgement that here was someone who needed care, and care was what they would provide. Samuel brought out a basin of warm water and a clean towel. Elizabeth looked at these simple items as if they were precious gifts. "I can't remember the last time I had warm water," she said softly. As Elizabeth washed her face and hands, Samuel noticed the careful way she moved, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space or using too much water. It was the behavior of someone who had learned to expect rejection and had trained herself to be as unobtrusive as possible. Martha emerged from the house carrying a tray laden with thick slices of cornbread butter honey and a bowl of hearty beef stew. The aroma alone was enough to make Elizabeth's stomach growl audibly. She ate slowly at first, as if she couldn't quite believe the food was real and wouldn't disappear if she moved too quickly. "This is the most wonderful thing I've ever tasted," she said between bites. Martha smiled and refilled her bowl without being asked. "Good food shared with good company is one of life's greatest pleasures," she said. "We're glad you're here to share it with us." As the afternoon wore on, Elizabeth began to relax. The rigid tension in her shoulders eased, and she started to speak more freely. She told them about losing her job at a factory in Dallas, about being evicted from her boarding house room, about walking for days trying to find work or anyone willing to give her a chance. "I made some mistakes," she said, looking down at her hands. "Back in Dallas, nothing terrible, but enough that people started talking. You know how it is in a small community within a city. Word gets around and suddenly no one wants to hire you." Samuel and Martha exchanged a look. They did know how it was. They had both grown up in small towns where reputations could follow you for decades and where one mistake could define you forever. "The thing about mistakes," Samuel said thoughtfully, "is that they don't have to be the end of your story. They can be the beginning of a better chapter if you let them." Elizabeth looked up at him with something like wonder in her eyes. "How can you be so kind to a stranger?" she asked. "How do you know I won't steal from you or cause trouble?" Martha set down her sewing and looked at Elizabeth with gentle eyes. "Child," she said, "we've all made mistakes. We've all had times when we needed someone to believe in us when we couldn't. Believe in ourselves. Maybe you will cause trouble, maybe you won't. But we've decided to take that chance because we remember what it felt like to need someone to take a chance on us." As evening approached, Samuel suggested that Elizabeth might want to stay the night. "We've got a small room above the barn," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's clean and warm and private." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears again. "I don't know how to repay you," she whispered. "You don't need to repay us," Martha said firmly. "But if you want to help around here while you're getting back on your feet, we certainly wouldn't turn down an extra pair of hands." The next morning, Elizabeth was up before dawn, helping Martha with the morning chores. She had a natural way with the animals, and Martha noticed that the horses seemed calmer around her. There was something gentle in her touch, something that spoke of deep empathy for creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. Over the following weeks, Elizabeth proved to be exactly what the ranch needed. She was hardworking and grateful, and she brought a quiet joy to the daily routines that had grown familiar over the years. She helped Martha with the cooking and cleaning, she assisted Samuel with the heavier ranch work, and she brought a fresh perspective to problems they had been wrestling with for months. More importantly, she brought laughter back to the ranch house. Her sense of humor was gentle and self-deprecating, and she had a gift for finding moments of lightness even in the most mundane tasks. Samuel and Martha found themselves smiling more often than they had in years. One evening, about a month after Elizabeth's arrival, the three of them were sitting on the front porch watching the sunset. Elizabeth had been telling them about her childhood, about growing up on a small farm with parents who had taught her to find beauty in simple things. "I lost my way for a while," she said softly. "After my parents died, I felt so alone, so angry. I made choices based on fear instead of hope, and those choices led me down a dark path. But sitting here now, I remember who I used to be, who I want to be again." Samuel leaned back in his chair and studied the young woman who had become such an important part of their lives. "You know, Elizabeth, there's an old saying about how we're all just walking each other home. I think that's what we do when we show kindness to someone. We help them find their way back to themselves." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "When I first came here, I was so ashamed of who I had become. I thought I was broken beyond repair. But you two never saw me as broken. You saw me as someone worth saving, and that made all the difference." Martha reached over and patted Elizabeth's hand. "We didn't save you, dear," she said. We just gave you a safe place to save yourself." As winter approached, Elizabeth made it clear that she wanted to stay permanently. She had written letters to contacts in nearby towns and had found a job at the local school tea.